You're listening to the European Parliamentary Research Service podcast on EU-US cooperation in justice and home affairs.
9/11 and its aftermath highlighted one special need above all others: the need to work together with international partners in the area of justice and home affairs.
Since then, the EU and the US have been working together more closely than ever in this field under the watchful eye of the European Parliament. Join us in this special investigation.
Despite formal cooperation between the EU and the US on justice and home affairs dating back to 1995, it is since the 11th of September attacks in 2001 that cooperation has gone up a gear.
So much so that today the two enjoy the most advanced cooperation in this field, especially in cross-border law enforcement and intelligence and counter-terrorism, which have been key priorities since 2001.
Cooperation has focused in particular on the fight against terrorism and transnational crime, law enforcement, personal data protection, border management, migration and border controls, and cybercrime.
And cooperation is bearing fruit. Regular high-level contacts and meetings, operational cooperation between security, intelligence and law enforcement agencies and legal agreements between the two have led to hundreds of successful joint operations each year and many foiled terrorist plots. However, huge challenges remain.
Indeed, revelations of US mass surveillance programs in Europe have seriously damaged transatlantic trust and intensified Europeans' concerns about the way in which data privacy and information exchanges are handled on the other side of the Atlantic. Furthermore, US detainee policies, border control and security measures, and differences in terrorist designation lists add to the existing tensions.
But let's first look at the positive results of this transatlantic cooperation in the field of justice and home affairs. Stay with us.
To counter the terrorist threat, joint operations have been run against identified terrorist networks, attacking their financial lifelines and online communications. According to Europol, in 2014 alone, more than 600 international operations targeting various forms of crime were initiated in cooperation with US federal agencies.
That's quite a number, and this teamwork led to many successes, for instance against the so-called darknet marketplaces offering drugs, weapons, counterfeit currency, unlicensed pharmaceuticals and many other illicit materials, including child pornography.
One of the factors behind these successes is proximity, thanks to the mutual exchange of liaison officers between Europol and Eurojust on the one hand, and US federal agencies on the other. But what are the priority areas of this cooperation?
Well, the principles and main areas of EU-US cooperation in this field are laid out in the Washington Statement of 2009. They include mobility, law enforcement, counter-terrorism, judicial cooperation, fundamental freedoms, resilience and international cooperation. But new priority areas were added in 2015, such as personal data protection, countering violent extremism, migration and border control, money laundering and terrorism financing, cybercrime or drugs. Let's examine some of these new priorities under the magnifying glass.
Since 2001, the EU and the US have concluded several agreements and adopted joint measures to counter the terrorist threat more effectively. But since 2008, cooperation has been extended to deal with an emerging and pressing need: countering radicalisation and violent extremism.
Meeting several times a year, the Steering Committee on Countering Violent Extremism tries to find answers to issues such as terrorist travel, countering online terrorist propaganda, and de-radicalisation programs in prisons, among others.
And with foreign fighters behind some of the most recent attacks in European capitals, finding ways to follow these persons and ensure they do not pose a threat to our societies is of paramount importance for both the EU and the US.
Today, cooperation on border and aviation security, information sharing between law enforcement agencies and efforts to counter radicalism have become interlinked issues in the fight against terrorism on both sides of the Atlantic. But we don't always share the same views.
No, we don't, and especially when it comes to detainee policies and terrorist designation lists, not to forget the US visa-free travel arrangements, which are not applied equally to all EU citizens.
Another area of cooperation raising important challenges is personal data protection, both with regard to information sharing for law enforcement purposes, such as the EU-US Agreement on Passenger Name Records and the SWIFT Agreement on access to banking information, and to the frameworks for commercial data transfers from the EU to the US.
The European Parliament has raised serious concerns about the way in which the US protects personal data, pointing at violations of EU citizens' basic rights. The mass surveillance activities in Europe by the US National Security Agency have deeply affected trust between the two sides of the Atlantic and added huge pressure for the revision of existing agreements regulating data transfers between the EU and the US.
A third area of cooperation, which is climbing high on the Transatlantic Agenda, is migration and border security. The EU-US platform on migration and refugee issues, launched in 2010, includes cooperation in areas such as return and reintegration of migrants, resettlement, biometrics, and fighting human trafficking, just to mention a few.
But the issue of visa-free travel for EU citizens wanting to go to the US is one of the sticking points in transatlantic relations, as the EU has been concerned about the toughening of US visa policy to counter the foreign fighter threat.
In the area of cybersecurity and cybercrime, cooperation started in 2010 and particular attention is paid to fighting sexual abuse online and the sexual exploitation of children. So now that we've examined some of the priority areas of cooperation, let's put on our judicial robes and look at the legal arrangements underpinning this cooperation.
Binding agreements between the EU and the US have been concluded on information sharing, on extradition and mutual legal assistance, on passenger name records, and on the sharing of financial data to fight terrorist financing.
The treaties on extradition and mutual legal assistance signed by the two partners came into force in 2010, thereby streamlining information exchange and establishing priorities in cases of competing extradition requests. As part of the deal, law enforcement authorities on both sides of the Atlantic can request each other's assistance in cross-border criminal investigations.
Agreements have also been concluded between the US and Europol to share strategic and personal information for law enforcement purposes. In 2015, this cooperation was extended to cover the sharing of information related to the recruitment and travel of foreign fighters and to combat illegal immigration and human smugglers.
Two issues which rank high on the EU's agenda, but there's more. In 2015, the EU and the US renewed their agreement to share SWIFT banking data as part of the US program tracking terrorist money.
And after several failed attempts due to European concerns about the protection of personal data by the US, a new agreement ensuring the transfer of passenger name records to the American authorities came into force in 2012, this time including provisions for the protection of sensitive data.
Ensuring an appropriate level of personal data protection has always been extremely important for the European Parliament and the Commission. Proof of this is the new framework for transatlantic data flows agreed by the European Commission and the US in February 2016.
The EU-US Privacy Shield replaces the old Safe Harbour framework, which was invalidated by the European Court of Justice in 2015. This new framework aims at protecting the fundamental rights of Europeans when their data are transferred to the United States by US companies, by placing stronger obligations on those companies and ensuring stronger monitoring and enforcement by US authorities.
Another legal tool to ensure the protection of citizens' personal data is the so-called EU-US Umbrella Agreement, initialled in September 2015, with the aim to provide data protection safeguards for personal information transferred between the EU and the US for law enforcement purposes, but for the agreement to be concluded, the Parliament needs to give its consent.
Indeed, and some members, plus the EP's legal service, have already raised concerns that the text may contravene some primary EU laws and the fundamental rights of EU citizens. So we'll have to follow this debate.
On border controls and transport security, the EU and the US have secured agreements ensuring the mutual recognition of each other's air and maritime cargo security regimes, and customs cooperation has been steadily reinforced since 1997.
So now that the legal basis underpinning this cooperation is clear, let's look at what's been achieved and what challenges lie ahead.
Well, cooperation between the EU and the US in the area of justice and home affairs has been steadily reinforced since the 9/11 attacks, particularly on law enforcement and counter-terrorism.
This has triggered some mutual learning, some experts even observing a certain policy convergence. But important differences and challenges remain, and after the Snowden revelations, mutual trust hasn't been fully recovered yet.
And it may take some time. EU and US views on how to counter the terrorist threat are still often the subject of intense debate, for instance, about the way in which the US treats terror suspects, but the main bone of contention in the transatlantic relationship is still data privacy, mainly due to the different legal standards and traditions.
Europeans have always been critical of the US for privileging security concerns over privacy rights, while Americans argue that their intelligence is also being used to protect Europeans. But actually, aren't we adopting the same security-centred approach?
Some experts certainly argue so. What's certainly true is that the EU and the US are still struggling to find the appropriate balance between strengthening security and facilitating transatlantic mobility and trade. So, a last question before we get to the end of this podcast. What has been the position of the European Parliament in matters of justice and home affairs?
The Lisbon Treaty increased the Parliament's legislative powers in the fields of police and criminal cooperation, and its oversight of Europol and Eurojust. Since then, the Parliament's consent is required to conclude agreements between the EU and international partners in this field.
And MEPs have not shied away from using these new powers. In 2010, they voted down the SWIFT agreement over data privacy concerns, triggering new negotiations. In the same year, and over similar concerns, the EP also postponed its vote of consent for the EU-US PNR agreement.
In 2014, in light of the revelations of massive US surveillance programs in Europe, the Parliament called for the suspension of all data transfer agreements with the US and requested the resumption of negotiations on the Umbrella Agreement to ensure effective and enforceable protection of EU citizens in the US and a high level of personal data protection as a precondition for restoring the broken trust.
In October 2015, the Parliament called again for the suspension of the Terrorist Finance Tracking Programme agreement with the US and urged the Commission to assess the implications of the Court of Justice ruling invalidating the Safe Harbour Agreement vis-à-vis all agreements with third countries allowing for the transfer of personal data.
So the Parliament is playing an important role as guarantor of the fundamental rights of all Europeans, at home and abroad.
You're listening to the European Parliamentary Research Service podcasts.